Activate the bell so you don't miss any content, and stay tuned because many more revelations are to come. Until next time, what do you think? Should we continue to blindly trust those in power, or is it time to look for more answers? If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories full of mystery and suspense. If a threat like the Soros really existed, would we be prepared to face it? And to what extent can we trust the institutions that are supposed to protect humanity? Marlowe's fight to bring the truth to light, despite the constant threat of being silenced, makes us question how much of our lives are controlled by secrets we don't know. And Jonathan Marlowe was ready to keep fighting, no longer as a lone man, but as the voice of a global resistance. Jonathan Marlowe's story leads us to reflect on how little we know about what happens behind the scenes of major events and missions. But he also knew that, behind the shadows, there was a growing resistance, a flame burning for his truth. The fate of humanity was at stake. Now, isolated on a remote island, but invisibly connected to the world, Marlowe awaited his next move. He knew that the Soros were watching, waiting, as well as the government that continued to hide its actions. The Soros threat was real, and humanity needed to be prepared. He had lost everything: his career, his ordinary life, his security. But in return, he had become the catalyst in a battle for the survival of the human race. His story, initially treated as fiction or delusion, gained traction as more evidence emerged, provided by insiders who, inspired by Marlowe's courage, also began to speak out. Despite the imminent danger, Marlowe knew his mission was just beginning. Resistance groups formed, dissident scientists, hackers, ex-military men all rallied around the truth that Marlowe had brought to light. But as Marlowe began to share specific details that only an insider could know, the tone of the discussions began to change. People started to believe. Over the next few days, posts began appearing in the darkest corners of the internet, on forums dedicated to conspiracy theories, ufology, and unconventional scientific discussions. The first responses were skeptical, as expected. I knew it couldn't be a simple scream into the void. I needed a strategy, a way to mobilize people around the world. His objective was clear: expose the truth, awaken resistance. His only ally was the truth itself. He decided that he would use the anonymous blog that his rescuers had created to publicize his discoveries. As the words flowed across the screen, Marlowe knew he was planting the seeds of something bigger. He could no longer trust official institutions. He described the fear in Colin's eyes, the indescribable terror of facing something beyond human understanding, but most of all, he wrote about the manipulation, the betrayal on the part of the government, which knew of the Soros existence and deliberately sent astronauts as sacrifices to keep the secret buried. And it was there, in that improvised refuge, that Marlowe began to write down his experiences. He wrote about Michael Collins, about the lunar mission, about the creatures that emerged from the depths of the moon to destroy the crew. They represented a global threat. He could not allow humanity to remain ignorant. He knew he was being hunted, but he also knew he had a greater responsibility now. The revelations about the Soros and the government's role in covering up the truth were more than just military secrets. In the quiet of that cabin, Marlowe sat in front of a small laptop provided by his rescuers. The screen flickered with a blank page, awaiting the first words of his story. These people were part of a clandestine group, individuals who, like him, had discovered too much, asked the wrong questions, and now lived on the margins, fighting against powerful, invisible forces. They led him to a simple hut, hidden among dense vegetation, where he would spend his first days in exile. When Dr. Jonathan Marlowe finally stepped onto the sand of the small island, he was greeted by a group of silent people, faces hardened by life off the radar. It was far from safe. Topic 15. Dramatic conclusion. The call to resistance. He knew that even here, the shadow of what he had discovered would still haunt him, and most importantly, I knew I needed to prepare for what came next. In the distance, a small island began to form on the horizon. It was his new refuge, temporary but necessary. There was no longer a place for him in that world controlled by secrets and conspiracies. He was alone, exiled from everything he had ever known, but still carrying the weight of a truth that no one was willing to hear. As the boat glided through the dark waters, Marlowe knew that his life as he knew it was over, couldn't go back. The engine was started and, in a matter of minutes, he was sailing out to sea, the lights on the coast getting further and further away until they disappeared completely. The sound of the wind and the salty smell of the sea filled the air, but despite the seemingly peaceful setting, Marlowe's mind was racing. Use it wisely. With a final nod, the figure helped Marlowe board the boat. For a while, the hooded man looked at him for the first time, revealing just a glimpse of his eyes, which, although stern, also conveyed empathy. They will do anything to silence you, but you still have something they cannot control. Knowledge. We're going to take you to a remote island in the Caribbean, off the main routes. There you'll be safe. And where will that take me? As far away as possible. The government has a lot of eyes. Marlowe swallowed hard, scanning the dark horizon. From here on, you'll be on your own. They won't find you that easily, but you'll have to be careful. In the distance, Marlowe could see a speedboat waiting silently, swaying gently to the rhythm of the waves. This is your way out, the figure said, finally breaking the silence. The place was remote, practically unknown, one of those corners of the world that no one would notice if it disappeared from the map. The hooded figure parked the car near an isolated pier. He knew that if he was found, Michael Collins' fate awaited him. After hours of travel, they arrived at a small coastal village. Marlowe, restless, could not relax. Even though he was on the run, real terror still hung over his head. They avoided the main routes, moving like ghosts in the night, leaving no trace. The hooded man seemed to know every curve and shortcut, as if he had traced that path dozens of times. Marlowe still didn't know if he could trust him fully, but the truth was simple. He had no other alternatives. The journey was long, with the car traveling along deserted secondary roads. He felt torn between fear of what would come next and the temporary relief of escaping his pursuers. Beside him, the hooded figure remained silent, focused on the road. Jonathan Marlowe watched the city fall behind him. The external environment, which had previously seemed oppressive, began to disappear into the darkness of the night. Escape and exile. As the car sped through the deserted streets, the answers he sought were still hidden in the shadows, and he would need to keep digging to reveal the truth. The only question left was, who was actually helping him? And what would be the price of this help? Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to escape and survive. But he knew, deep down, that the fight was far from over. Let's get you out of here before they realize you're gone. The mysterious figure's voice was firm and determined, but at the same time there was something comforting about it, as if that person knew exactly what they were doing. They quickly drove away from the city, and for a moment Marlowe felt a wave of relief. "Do you think you were followed?" asked Marlowe, still suspicious. "It doesn't matter now." The engine started, and the figure sped through the city streets, using shortcuts that Marlowe had never noticed. The sound of screeching tires and the wind hitting the windows indicated that they were running away from something, or someone. "We don't have much time." Marlowe reluctantly got into the car. When he arrived at the scene, a hooded figure was waiting for him next to a car with the lights off. "Come in," said the voice, low and urgent. At 2 a.m., wearing a hood and with his heart racing, Marlowe headed to the indicated alley. The place was gloomy, lit only by a dim street lamp. He spent the next day in a state of maximum alert, monitoring every movement around him, waiting for the moment of possible escape. I knew that once I made that decision, there would be no going back. But Marlowe knew he had no choice. If he wanted to have any chance of escaping persecution, he would have to take the risk. "I will take care of the rest." Was it a trap? Could be. "Tomorrow night, 2 a.m., alley behind Main Avenue. If you want to survive, be there." The answer came with an unexpected proposal. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that we can get out of this together." The stranger seemed to know much more than Marlowe had revealed in any public place. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to gain some control over the situation. The urgency of those words was clear, but there was something more. "You don't have much time." Marlowe felt his heart quicken. He decided to respond cautiously. "How do I know I can trust you?" The answer came almost immediately. "If you don't listen to me, they will catch you." Who would that person be? How could I trust a stranger, especially in an environment where betrayal seemed to lurk around every corner? However, the truth was simple. He was out of options. The siege around him grew tighter every day, and if he didn't take quick action, he would be the next to disappear. "I can help." For a moment he hesitated. The message was short and direct. I know what you discovered. They are after you. One night, while scouring obscure internet forums for any clues or help, Dr. Marlowe received an anonymous message. The only thing he knew was that if he got caught, he would end up like Collins. Or worse. Topic 13. Mysterious help. The minutes passed like an eternity. He knew he couldn't trust anyone else. Not the government, not the military, not anyone connected to that damn project. I was running out of options. He was a hunted man, hunted by something bigger and more powerful than he could have ever imagined. Marlowe took a series of tricky turns, trying to lose the car. He managed to gain a small advantage and parked in a narrow alley, hiding for a few moments to breathe. He needed a plan. He needed to hide. He needed to escape. But where? And how long could I run? His mind was racing. He knew he couldn't go home, not anymore. As he drove away, he noticed in the rearview mirror that the black car was following him. The cat and mouse game had begun. He knew they were ready to act. Without thinking twice, Marlowe got into his car and drove away as fast as he could. Inside, he could clearly see a man in a suit, with sunglasses watching him. His eyes didn't look away, and the cold smile that appeared on his face made Marlowe's blood run cold. One day, as he left his house, he noticed something was different. The black car that was always parked outside now had its window ajar. I slept little, always waiting for something terrible to happen. Time was running out. He started locking all the doors and windows, but he knew that if they wanted to get him, none of that would matter. His paranoia grew every day. The nights became unbearable. The mere sound of a creaking door made him jump out of his bed. They were discreet, but Marlowe noticed them. They were there, watching him, waiting for the right moment to act. Every step he took, every movement he made, he felt the weight of invisible eyes. He began to notice small signs. A black car parked on the corner, always the same. Men in suits walking down the street several times a day, but never stopping to interact with anyone. From that moment on, he was no longer just an investigator. He was a target. Marlowe returned home, but the feeling of being watched never left him. And now, he knew too much. His name was undoubtedly at the top of a list. Jonathan Marlowe left the house in a state of absolute shock. The reality of what had happened had finally hit home. The government was not only trying to cover up the events on the moon, but also eliminating anyone who might reveal the truth. Topic 12. The protagonist is hunted. After attending Michael Collins' funeral, he was involved in something much bigger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. They were willing to do anything to protect that secret, and now their own lives were on the line. Whoever else knew about the Soros was dead, and Marlowe knew that if he continued, he would be next. Now, more than ever, he needed to be cautious. Overcome by revolt, Marlowe walked away from the place, feeling the weight of unspoken words. They had done it. He knew too much, and now he was dead. The truth was clear as day. Michael Collins was never released. He was eliminated. They had killed him. That couldn't be a coincidence. Collins's wife was in the courtyard, her face swollen from crying. Marlowe felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Upon arriving at Collins's residence, he was greeted by a devastating sight. There was a funeral taking place. People in black clothes walked around the house, many of them crying silently. Gripped by a mixture of anger and panic, he left the facility toward Collins' home. He needed to see with his own eyes, needed to confirm that the man at the center of all this mystery was still alive. Marlowe knew that Collins was in no condition to be released. That excuse made no sense, and he could feel the lie in the air. He went home to rest. But something was terribly wrong. The nurse shrugged, clearly embarrassed by the situation. That's what they said. Released? He was in critical condition. What do you mean, released? Hi. Marlowe couldn't hide his disbelief. He has been released, Dr. Marlowe, she said, her voice wavering. Confused, Marlowe looked for hospital staff. Where is Michael Collins? He asked a nurse who, visibly uncomfortable, looked away before answering. Marlowe noticed the cold gaze of some of the employees, and an uncomfortable feeling of uneasiness was growing within him. When he entered Collins's treatment room, he found it empty. However, upon arriving, he realized something was wrong. The hallways, normally bustling with routine activity, were eerily quiet. The morning after his discovery of the 1978 mission, Marlowe arrived at the facility ready to continue his sessions with Michael Collins. I knew there was much more that Collins could reveal if he could access it correctly. He knew that at any moment he could be confronted by the same men in suits who took Collins. The fear became more palpable every day, but what he didn't expect was the brutal turn of events that was about to occur. Marlowe's nights became sleepless. Every shadow seemed to hide spies, and every unexpected sound made his heart race. Topic 11. Second twist. Death of the survivor, Doctor. What Marlowe knew was enough to put him in danger, but the central piece of the puzzle was still missing. What was the government planning regarding the Saros? And why did they continue to send astronauts, even though they knew the threat they faced? Those questions wouldn't leave his mind as he tried in silence to formulate the next step in his investigation. He needed to act quickly. Your movements monitored. It was only a matter of time before the forces protecting these secrets did something about it. He knew that if he continued on this path, his life would also be at risk. His footsteps were heard. Astronauts were sent out knowing they might not return, and the true nature of what they faced was never revealed to them. Marlowe's heart beat fast as the truth unfolded before him. But, it seemed, these missions were much more than simple scientific expeditions. They were, in fact, calculated sacrifices. Marlowe felt a wave of shock when he read those words. The pattern was clear. The government had sent several missions to the moon, all with the same goal, to find and study the anomaly. The mission was officially reported as a failure, but what the report suggested was something much more disturbing. A team of astronauts sent to investigate an anomaly on the lunar surface never returned. Communications were mysteriously interrupted, and, like Collins's mission, the fate of the crew was covered up by the government. One silent night, while reviewing old reports in his room, he found a document that shouldn't be there. It was an old report, dated 1978, detailing a lunar mission that had never been released to the public. Frustrated, Marlowe decided to take a more direct approach. Under the guise of better understanding Michael Collins' mental state, he began asking more specific questions of the people working at the facility. He began his search for answers by reviewing classified documents he had access to. Yet these files always seemed incomplete, carefully edited to hide the most crucial parts of the story. But even with the constant fear of being watched, he continued. There was something dark and insidious in the shadows of what he had discovered, and Marlowe was not one to ignore the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. Marlowe deepened his investigation. He realized he was treading dangerous ground. He knew his uncomfortable questions and growing curiosity wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Topic 10. Protagonist's secret investigation as Doctor. Not only did the government know about the Saros, they were willing to do anything, absolutely anything, to ensure that this truth never came to light, and Marlowe knew that if he wasn't careful, he would be the next to go. Men in suits who seemed to always be around but never directly interacted with him. It was clear to him now. Marlowe himself was being watched. He began to notice black cars parked outside his house. The more he dug, the more he felt his own life was at risk. It was no longer just Michael Collins who was in danger. Marlowe began to feel a growing fear. He knew he was getting involved in something very dangerous. They had sent expeditions to investigate, but never with the intention of bringing back any information to the public. They didn't want to explore the moon. They wanted to hide what they had found there. And they all had something in common. The same detected anomaly, the same pattern of disappearance, and the same government cover-up. It was evident that the government had known about the existence of the Saros for a long time. There were vague mentions of other lunar missions that were never publicly acknowledged. Marlowe discovered references to at least 2 previous expeditions that had disappeared without a trace, one in the 1970s, the other in the early 1980s. He discreetly asked younger employees, those who, like him, might not know exactly what was going on. What he discovered was shocking. Determined to discover the truth, Marlowe began to investigate on his own. He took advantage of the moments he was alone in the facility to explore files and conversations he had previously ignored. He also began to notice the documents he received, always carefully selected with details omitted or erased. It was as if he was being held in the dark, treated only as a tool to access information from Collins without ever being told the full picture. Marlowe began to notice the signs. During meetings with officers, there was always an air of secrecy between them, a subtle body language that indicated that not everything was being said. The pieces didn't fit together. The coldness with which military and NASA officials reacted to Collins' confessions, the complete disinterest in his mental well-being, indicated that there was much more being hidden than he initially realized. Marlowe began to realize that the true enemy was not only the alien threat, but also those in control of the situation here on Earth. There was something wrong, very wrong, with how the government was handling the information. Topic 9. Growing distrust in government. As Michael Collins's revelations became more and more disturbing, Dr. It wasn't just the government that knew the truth. The Soros knew it too, and were waiting for the right moment to take control. Those words stuck in Marlowe's mind. Marlowe, they are waiting. He was remembering his team's final moments, how the Soros dominated them, physically and mentally. They will come back, Doctor. But the others? Collins began to shake again, trying to manipulate my thoughts, make me act against my will. I managed to resist for a while. I don't know how, but they were there, inside my head. Are you saying they have the ability to control human beings? Marlowe asked, his voice firmer now. Collins nodded slowly, as if the words weighed him down. This was more than a simple alien invasion. The Soros had the power to enter human minds, and that changed everything. Marlowe was silent for a moment, processing Collins' words, mind control. I could hear them, feel their thoughts. It was as if they could control each of us if they wanted to. Communicated somehow. They were inside our minds, and when they attacked, it was fast, but more than that, they knew we couldn't beat them. They knew we were there, lost, defenseless. Intelligent creatures, aliens that not only reacted but planned. They studied us. Marlowe felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The Soros watched us from the moment we arrived. They didn't attack us right away. But we were wrong, very wrong. At first we thought it was just us, that we were alone in that desolate expanse. Began Collins, his voice low. Michael, I need you to tell me more about what you saw. Marlowe began, trying to be as careful as possible. Collins hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting away, as if he was trying to avoid reliving the horrors again. His appearance was deteriorating rapidly, as if each painful memory was consuming him from the inside out. His skin was paler, his eyes were deeper, and the expression of constant terror was still etched on his face. He needed answers. In the second session, Marlowe saw Collins even more shaken. And even worse, perhaps they were planning something much more terrible. Marlowe decided to confront Collins again. The lunar mission had been a failure, yes, but the Soros, those alien creatures of nightmares, were not a mere distant memory. They were still there. There was something bigger behind it all, something the government was deliberately hiding. But most disturbing of all was the feeling that the threat Collins had mentioned was not yet over. Marlowe's mind was filled with uncertainty and fear. Michael Collins's story wouldn't get out of his head. Topic 8. Continuing alien threat. In the days following the hypnotic session, Dr. and they had sent Collins and his team as a deliberate sacrifice. Now Marlowe was caught in this web of secrets, and he knew that Collins's fate, and perhaps his own, hung in the balance. With those words echoing in his mind, Marlowe left the room, feeling like a pawn in a much bigger game. They knew. The government knew, he muttered. They knew from the first lost mission. Nothing else mattered. Before leaving the room, a sentence said by one of the younger officers confirmed what Marlowe had begun to fear. There was no trace of concern for human life. Everything seemed to revolve around finding out more about those creatures. Marlowe felt a wave of distrust creep in. It wasn't just the confidentiality of the case that disturbed him, but the cold and calculating way in which these men handled the situation. Creatures. And you must understand that what you heard here is absolutely confidential. Marlowe, the senior officer began, his voice controlled. It is imperative that you continue to work with Collins. We need more information about these. The feeling that there was a bigger secret hanging in the air was undeniable. Doctor, the officer's reaction was, to say the least, disturbing. They exchanged quick glances, as if something wasn't being said out loud, something Marlowe didn't know, perhaps from another civilization. They knew they were in danger, but no one prepared them for what they would face there. He said they found ruins, structures. The highest-ranking man who had led Marlowe there crossed his arms. What else did he say? He asked with a coldness that made Marlowe shiver. Collins is the only survivor. One of the military officers remained impassive, while others seemed to show a brief glimpse of surprise, soon replaced by a neutral expression. Creatures on the moon, they massacred your team. When he entered, gazes turned to him, full of expectation. He talked about the Soros, said Marlowe, Feeling the weight of those words, Marlowe, still shaken by what he had heard, went to the meeting room, where the same men in uniform were waiting for him. There was a tension in the air, as if they already knew something terrible had been discovered. He knew that forcing more revelations at that moment could completely break the astronaut's already fragile mental state. He also knew he would need to report his findings to his superiors. There were more things to be unearthed, truths that could not be ignored, no matter how terrible they were. When the session ended, Collins was exhausted, and Marlowe let him rest. Michael Collins's confession had taken him into uncharted territory, a territory where science and reason met the inexplicable. However, something inside him knew he needed to continue. Topic 7. First twist. The government hides the truth. Marlowe was paralyzed. That was just the surface of the terror Collins had witnessed, but what he didn't know was how much this revelation would affect not only the astronaut himself, but also him, and the way they both saw the world from that moment on. They didn't stop until everyone was dead. Marlowe knew there was more. I could only hear the screams, see the shadows. I hid, Collins whispered. While they massacred my friends, I hid in a crevice. Collins began to sob softly, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as if he was trying to hold on to reality. Marlowe felt a mixture of compassion and horror as he realized the intensity of the trauma Collins was carrying. They tore our spacesuits to shreds. I heard the screams of my friends, saw them being torn apart, piece by piece, the blood floating in gravity, his claws sharp as blades. One second we were surveying the ruins, the next, they were upon us. They were fast, Collins continued, his eyes still closed, as if he was reliving every second in his mind. We didn't have time to react. He had seen these creatures, and from the tone of her voice, I knew they weren't just imaginary. Marlowe felt an icy cold run up his spine. Collins's description, still in a trance, was too detailed and vivid to be simply the fruit of a traumatized mind. They saw us, and then they started hunting us. Black, soulless eyes. They were amphibians with scaly brownish-green bodies and a type of bluish plumage on their chests. Huge eyes that do not belong to this world. They emerged from fissures in the lunar soil, as if the moon itself was vomiting them up. The sorrows, Collins murmured, creatures. Marlowe, tense, realized the weight of that sentence. He knew that the they referred to something beyond anything humans had ever encountered. That's when they appeared. The room was completely silent. He paused and his entire body shook. Marlowe watched intently, aware that he was about to hear something incomprehensible. At first we thought it was a lunar tremor, perhaps caused by a small meteorite, but cracks began to spread across the surface around us. It was no longer the peaceful emptiness of the moon. We feel a vibration. The silence transformed. After we found the ruins, Collins began, his voice wavering. Something changed, the atmosphere around us. Marlowe, seeing the growing terror taking over his patient, adjusted his position, trying to maintain control of the situation. What Collins was about to reveal seemed to be buried so deep in his subconscious that just the act of remembering made him relive the nightmare. Michael Collins' breathing became even more irregular, his fists clenched so hard that his knuckles turned white. And what came next, Marlowe knew, could be more horrible than anyone had ever imagined. Topic 6. Revelation of alien creatures. The truth found us first. Collins began to breathe faster, his body tensed again, and the room, previously quiet, now seemed filled with a dense atmosphere, as if something invisible was about to emerge from the shadows of the astronaut's mind. To find the truth, but the truth. What happened next? We were sent there. Collins' words were filled with a deep terror, and Marlowe knew he was only scratching the surface of what had happened on that mission. Continue, Michael. Marlowe felt a knot form in his stomach. What he was hearing went beyond what any normal space mission could contain. Collins's body began to shake. Spacesuits, tools, and human bones, and there were remains, as if they were from another civilization. Something ancient, much older than anything we knew. Ruins, Collins replied, his voice thick with repressed emotion. Structures. Explain, Michael, what did you find? Marlowe encouraged him. Collins began to describe the surface of the moon, the barren desert, the absolute silence, the crushing emptiness. However, he also mentioned something that wasn't in the official reports. There was something there, something that shouldn't have been there, until we landed. Marlowe stood at attention, listening to every word carefully. "We left on June 12, 1990, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Everything seemed normal. He was falling into a trance, diving into the depths of his own mind. And then, he started talking. "I want you to tell me what happened from the beginning." Collins's breathing became slower and deeper. "I want you to go back to that day, to the lunar mission." Marlowe led him into a hypnotic trance state, a level where the barriers of the conscious mind began to dissolve. "Michael," Marlowe began, his voice calm. Marlowe sat next to Collins, speaking in a calm monotone, guiding him into a state of deep relaxation. Collins resisted at first, his body still tense, but gradually his breathing began to slow and his muscles relaxed. The astronaut's mind was blocked by layers of trauma, and the only way to understand what he experienced was to delve deep into the man's troubled subconscious. With the equipment assembled, the lights in the room were gently dimmed. The first treatment session was carefully planned. Marlowe decided to use hypnosis, a technique he had mastered, to access Collins' repressed memories. Something truly terrible awaited him. Topic 5. First treatment sessions. Collins nodded slowly, but his eyes remained blank. Marlowe felt a chill run down his spine. "Michael, I'm going to try an approach that might help you remember," Marlowe said, his voice calm. "If you trust me, we can start to understand what happened." Marlowe knew this would not be an easy task. There was something terrible hidden in Michael Collins's mind, and he would be the one to try to unearth these secrets. There was a darkness there, something that seemed not to belong to ordinary human experience. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by Collins' rapid, ragged breathing. He was in a state of extreme stress, on the verge of a complete breakdown. The psychiatrist had already treated many serious cases throughout his career, but there was something about this man that bothered him deeply. Marlowe approached slowly, observing every detail. The tension in Collins's muscles was evident. For a brief moment, Collins looked in his direction, but his eyes expressed nothing but deep terror, as if he were seeing beyond space and time, something Marlowe could not yet understand. The astronaut didn't speak a word. He just continued to stare into space, his lips moving almost imperceptibly, as if he was muttering to himself. "Jonathan Marlowe, I'm here to help you." "Michael?" Marlowe called softly, trying not to startle him. "I'm Doctor." Her hands were visibly shaking in her lap, her fingers restless, as if they were trying to grab something invisible in the air. He did not seem aware of his surroundings, and his blank gaze was not focused on Marlowe, but rather on some distant point, as if he were reliving over and over a horror that never ended. Collins, once one of the fittest and most mentally strong men of his time, now looked like a shadow of his former self, sitting in a metal chair. His shoulders were hunched, his skin pale, his eyes sunk into dark, empty sockets. When the door creaked open, Marlowe came face to face with Michael Collins. The sight of the man in front of him was shocking. When he arrived, he felt a growing uneasiness. Something dark hung in the air, a feeling that what he was about to witness would change his perception of the world forever. He was led down a long hallway to a room with a solid steel door. The next day, Marlowe was escorted to a secret facility. The building was hidden in the heart of a restricted military area, away from prying eyes, surrounded by layers of security and surveillance, and he feared that what he found might be far darker than anyone there was prepared to face. Topic 4. Introduction of the traumatized survivor. Accepting that task was not a simple professional decision. It was something that would change the course of his life. Whatever was hidden in Collins' mind was about to be revealed. Marlowe felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew he had no choice. "We need you to find out what he saw, what happened to the others, and most importantly, what this anomaly really was." "That's where you come in, Dr. Marlowe. He won't talk about what happened, but his mind is devastated." And yet, here he was, returning alone, carrying something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Collins came back, changed, the NASA official added, his voice cracking slightly. That name echoed in Marlowe's mind. Michael Collins was one of the most respected astronauts of his generation, someone trained to face the impossible. Inside, there was only one survivor, Michael Collins. A return module was found adrift in space. We were able to bring it back to Earth. Marlowe leaned forward, intrigued but still not fully understanding the reason for his summons. 6 months later, the officer continued, we received a weak signal. It was weeks of desperation trying to re-establish communication, but nothing eventually. We gave the crew as lost. Or at least, not in the way we expected. There was contact with the crew in the first few hours, but soon after, everything went silent. The officer paused, as if the next words carried an even heavier burden. The mission never came back. In June 1990, we sent a team of astronauts on a lunar exploration mission. The official objective was to collect additional data from the surface, but the real mission was to investigate an anomaly detected by previous probes. One of the NASA officials, a man with gray hair and a lined face, stepped forward. He held a folder full of confidential documents. Something very serious had happened on that lunar mission, and he was the key to unraveling what had really happened. "I'm listening," he said finally, controlling the nervousness that threatened to take over his voice. All eyes were fixed on Marlowe, awaiting his response. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders, but at the same time his curiosity, the one that had led him to study the mysteries of the human mind, was beginning to manifest itself. Topic 3. Meeting with authorities and secret mission. The atmosphere in the meeting room was suffocating. He vaguely remembered rumors that something had gone wrong back then, but nothing official had ever been released. Now the truth seemed to be right before his eyes, and he was being drawn into the center of something bigger than he could ever imagine. "We need you to treat him and obtain critical information." The mention of a 1990 moon mission made Marlowe freeze. A survivor of a lunar mission, the last one in 1990, he is traumatized. The soldier looked at him for a moment, as if measuring the impact his words would have. "We have an extremely sensitive case." Marlowe, still dazed, tried to speak, but his voice came out as a whisper. "What's this about?" he asked, his mind spinning a mile a minute. "Marlowe, your presence here is no accident. We urgently need your services." One of the soldiers, with a rigid appearance and a closed expression, broke the silence with a deep voice. "Doctor." High-ranking officials. What was he, a simple psychology professor, doing there? There they were. High-ranking men in uniform, and, even more surprising, people from NASA scientists. The walls seemed to close in around him, while the voices of other men, in hushed conversations, echoed through the space. Marlowe was guided to a large room with a large table in the center, surrounded by chairs. Deep down, he knew that his life would never be the same after crossing those doors. As he was taken to a narrow corridor, the feeling of suffocation grew in his chest. They pulled him out of the vehicle and unceremoniously led him inside. Marlowe looked around and noticed that the environment, although modest, was filled with silent tension, as if something important was about to happen. The car finally stopped in front of a simple, almost insignificant building. It was one of those places that people pass by every day without realizing it, invisible to ordinary eyes. Their faces were impassive, emotionless, as if this was just another everyday task. Marlowe tried to remember if he had ever seen them before, but they were complete strangers. Shadowy figures who seemed not to belong to this moment, as if they came from some distant nightmare. And in a way it was. The men beside him didn't say a word during the ride. Jonathan Marlowe watched the lights flash past the windows, but his mind was far away, desperately trying to make sense of it all. Who were those men? What did they want with him? The fear was now mixed with a growing sense of paranoia, as if he was being pulled into something much larger than he could comprehend. The car moved quickly through the dark streets of the city. Doctor, the answer to these questions would be far more terrifying than he could have imagined. Topic 2. Sudden and mysterious interruption. Something terrible was about to be revealed, and he was at the center of it, even though he hadn't asked to be there. What do these men know that he hasn't discovered yet? And why him? As the car pulled away, Marlowe looked outside, seeing his ordinary life speeding away in the rearview mirror. He didn't know that, at that moment, he was embarking on a dark journey full of secrets that would change his life forever. Not knowing what was happening, fear took over his mind. Who were those men? What did they want with him? He tried to resist, but the grip was firm, determined, and in a matter of seconds, he was taken out of his office, pushed into a black car that was waiting for him on the sidewalk. "Marlowe, we need you to accompany us," said the man in a firm voice, with no room for questioning. Marlowe's heart skipped a beat. Before he could react, one of them grabbed him tightly by the arm. "Doctor." Upon opening it, he was met with two men dressed in black, their expressions unwavering and their gaze piercing. No words were said. Something was wrong. Marlowe, with his curiosity piqued, slowly got up and walked towards the door. But the sound continued, an insistent noise outside the door. A strange sound broke the silence of his office. He ignored it, thinking it was a late client, someone who had forgotten to reschedule a session. Marlowe would never admit it, but the monotony of his routine made him restless. And it was at that moment that it all started. He was a methodical, disciplined man and liked to know that his life followed a well-defined plan. But the truth is that behind this comfort, there was a hidden desire for something more. I was tired, but satisfied. Another successful day, he thought. Something was about to happen, and he didn't know what it was, but he felt it, the kind of foreboding that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. He finished his last appointment of the day, closed his notebook, adjusted his glasses on his nose, and leaned back in the leather chair. His life, although routine, brought a certain comfort in predictability. That afternoon, however, would be the last of their common life. It was a peaceful afternoon, similar to many others he had experienced in recent years. Marlowe had built a solid career helping people navigate the dark labyrinths of their minds, leading his patients along tortuous paths to the light. Jonathan Marlowe, an expert in psychology and psychiatry, scribbled notes in his worn leather notebook. The sun was already beginning to set, casting golden rays that passed through the thin curtains of his private office. Protagonist introduction and quiet routine. The soft, rhythmic sound of the wall clock echoed in the silent room as Professor Dr.